The wheels came in ones and twos at first, sometimes three at a time, stacked in the bed of a borrowed mule cart, their iron rims split or bent, their wooden spokes cracked through, their hubs so punished by Rocky Mountain roads that the mortise joints had simply given up their grip and pulled apart like bread. Nora Vass hauled them anyway. She hauled them down the long switchback from the valley town of Crail's Notch, where the freight companies dumped their ruined equipment rather than pay the wheelwright in Harmon for the repair. And she hauled them along the creek road that ran behind her property, and she wrestled them through the double doors of the barn her father had built in the decade before the war with lumber. He had milled himself from yellow pine so old and dense it rang like iron when you struck it. Inside, alone except for a gray mule named Patch who watched everything from the darkness of his stall with large, unhurried eyes, she stacked the wheels in rows. 31 that first autumn, 47 the following spring. Nobody asked her why, or rather, people asked, but when she answered they stopped listening because the answer was not the kind that resolves a question. She told them she was fixing them. They said that was not a trade for a woman alone, that the labor of a wheelwright required a forge, and a cooper's bench, and an apprenticeship of years. She said she had all three. They smiled and nodded and changed the subject, and some of them, on the walk home, felt a quiet worry for her that they mistook for kindness. Her father, Elias Vass, had been a wheelwright in Harmon before his lungs failed him. The shop had passed by debt to a man named Aldred Corwin, who ran it at twice the price and half the craft. But Elias had kept a ledger, 3 of them in fact, worn brown books the size of a man's palm that his daughter had found tucked inside the false bottom of his tool chest after the funeral. The first book was accounts. The second was measurements, hundreds of them, the diameter ratios for every wheel size he had ever built, the spoke angles for different loads, the green wood shrinkage tables for ash and elm and white oak, the thickness tolerances for iron tires at every rim circumference. The third book was something else. It was his record of failures, every wheel he had ever seen break, and why, and what had been done wrong in the making, and what could have been done right. He had written the failures in red ink, which was an unusual extravagance, and at the front of that third book, on the page before the first entry, he had written in his plain square hand, "The iron tells you everything, if you hold it long enough to listen." Nora had read that line when she was 11 years old. She had read it again the week she buried him. Now she read it again each morning before she opened the barn. The iron tells you everything, if you hold it long enough to listen. She did not post the line anywhere. She did not say it aloud to anyone. But she worked by it the way a carpenter works by plumb, without thinking, as an organizing principle beneath every decision. In October of the first year, Aldred Corwin drove out to her property in his good black wagon behind a pair of matched bays, the kind of matched bays a man buys to be seen with, and he came through the gate without knocking and found her in the yard with an iron tire laid over the bed of her ash and clay fire, heating the rim with the slow patience her father's second ledger prescribed. Corwin watched her for a moment before he spoke, and in that moment his face arranged itself into an expression that was probably meant to be concern, but sat on him more like satisfaction. He said she was going to crack that tire if she kept heating it unevenly. She said she had heated it 3 times before and had not cracked it yet. He said 3 times was luck and the 4th was odds. She turned the rim a quarter rotation and said nothing. He stood in her yard for another minute, watching, and then he said, in the voice of a man delivering an unpleasant truth for someone else's benefit, that the freight companies were not going to pay her for repairs. They had a contract with his shop in Harmon. They had always had a contract with his shop. She did not look up. She said she knew that. He asked her then why she was doing it. She set the rim in the dirt and looked at him directly and said, "Because the wheels are there." He left, and later in Crail's Notch he told 2 or 3 people that Elias Vass's daughter had lost the thread after the grief, which was understandable, and that someone ought to look in on her, which was the sort of thing people say when they mean the opposite. By December she had repaired 19 wheels. She had rebuilt 11 from components, using the spoke blanks she had roughed out from a stand of young ash she had harvested from the creek bottom in early September, while the wood still held sap enough to bend without splitting, then racked and dried over the barn's upper loft. She had not sold any of the wheels. She stacked them on the east wall of the barn in 2 long rows, tires fitted and keyed, hubs packed with grease and corked, spokes driven and wedged and checked against her father's angle tables. Each wheel leaned against its neighbor in a line that grew, week by week, the way a well-tended thing grows, without drama, without announcement, by accumulated increment. Patch watched. He was not a young mule, and he had no particular history of vigilance. But in that barn he watched Nora Vass work with the steady, unblinking attention of an animal that senses something it cannot name. Sometimes at night she read the ledgers by lantern light at the little table near his stall, and the mule would lower his long gray head until his muzzle nearly rested on the open page, and Nora would say, not unkindly, "Get your nose out of the numbers," and Patch would lift his head and blink in the yellow light, and she would go on reading. Winter came cold that year. The freight road from the valley up through Crail's Notch was bad in winter, and had always been bad in winter, and the freight companies who used it had always absorbed a certain number of wheel failures as ordinary cost and budgeted accordingly. Aldred Corwin's shop in Harmon did good winter business. The repair prices he charged in January and February were what a man could charge when the road was iced and the nearest alternative was 2 days' journey south. The freight managers paid and grumbled and passed the cost down the chain in the way that costs always travel, and nobody questioned the system because the system had always been the system. A young man from the valley named Silas Rook arrived at Nora Vass's property in February of that winter on foot, which was already unusual, and asked if she sold wheels, which was more unusual still. He was maybe 23 years old, slight in the frame but with the kind of posture that comes from long habitual attention, the posture of someone who notices things and files them. He had come on foot because his freight wagon had thrown a wheel half a mile back on the creek road, and the wheel was unsalvageable, and Corwin's shop was 4 miles farther in the wrong direction, and the load he was carrying would not wait. Nora took him into the barn. She showed him the east wall. He stopped walking and looked at the rows of finished wheels for a moment without speaking, the way a man looks at something he did not expect to find where he found it. He said, "How many?" She said, 61. He said, "You built all of these." She said, "Rebuilt most. Built 11 new." He asked the price. She told him a figure that was less than half of Corwin's emergency rate. He said he would take 2 and come back for more, and he asked if he could bring her the broken wheels from his other wagons, the ones waiting on repair in the valley yard. She said yes, and he shook her hand without ceremony and took 2 wheels out to the creek road and was back with a load of 8 broken wheels within 3 days. And he came back again in March and again in April, and he never once asked why she was doing it because by March he had already figured out the answer. Nora was building inventory. Not for a season, for something specific. She did not tell Silas Rook what she expected, but he was quiet and observant, and he had grown up in a farming family that read weather by the color of the evening sky and the behavior of the creek in March. And somewhere in the 2nd month of their arrangement, he began helping her on Fridays without being asked, splitting spoke blanks and stacking billets and spelling her at the sledge when her shoulder was tired from the rim work, and they worked in the particular comfortable silence of 2 people whose purposes have aligned without a formal negotiation. By midsummer of the 2nd year, Nora Vass had repaired or rebuilt 212 wheels, which was a number that would have meant nothing to anyone who did not know what she was preparing for. The 2 people who did know were Nora Vass and a dead wheelwright named Elias, and the gray mule, who kept his counsel. In the 3rd book, the red ink book of failures, Elias Vass had written a single long entry in the autumn before he died, different in character from all the others because it was not about a specific wheel that had broken in a specific way. It was about a pattern. He had noticed over a span of 30 years that a bad summer followed by a hard winter, followed by a spring of heavy rain, produced a predictable sequence of events on the Crails Notch freight road. The road ran through a cut in the ridge that funneled weather. In the bad years, the creek that ran beside the lower section of the road swelled in spring and pulled at the roadbed, and the freight companies, always reluctant to spend on infrastructure, always patched the worst sections with whatever material was nearest, usually river gravel, which compacted poorly and gave the road a loose, unpredictable surface. On that surface, fully loaded freight wagons threw wheels at 3 times the normal rate. Spare wheels were unavailable. Corwin's shop, 4 miles out of the route, charged emergency prices that were ruinous. Loads were delayed. Merchants in Crails Notch and the valley towns went without supplies for weeks at a time, and the costs of those delays were borne by the small operators who could least afford them. Elias had written, "This is not bad luck. This is a sequence. You can read it in the road in February if you know what to look for." Then he had written, "The years that run this pattern come about once in 10 to 12. We are now due." He had written that in the autumn before he died. His daughter had read it and counted forward. The summer of Nora's second year was dry and thin, and the pastures across the ridge turned the pale, dispirited color of straw by August. The winter that followed came early and broke things. The spring after that came with 10 days of driving rain in March that swelled the creek and pulled the gravel from the roadbed in long, graceless slides. By April, the lower freight road was a thing you navigated rather than drove, and the freight wagons from the valley companies went through it sideways, their wheels finding and losing purchase in ruts that changed position between one morning and the next. Corwin had not stocked ahead. Why would he? He had a contract and a shop and 30 years of business that had always come to him without requiring him to imagine otherwise. His timber for new spokes was green, pulled too early because demand had outrun his supply, and green wood speaks its objection in a specific language. It cracks along the grain just where the stress is highest, which is precisely where a spoke cannot afford to crack. Nora Vass knew this because her father had written it in red ink. She spent the 10 days of March rain doing nothing but finishing the last of her open repairs and checking every wheel on the east wall for any tolerance she had missed. She moved through the barn in the gray, wet light with the ledgers open on the workbench, running her thumb down the measurement columns, comparing what was written to what she could measure, adjusting a wedge here, repacking a hub there. Patch stood in his stall with his ears forward in that specific way he had when something was coming that he could smell but not see. On the first dry morning, Silas Rook came at sunrise and said the road below the cut had thrown 6 wagons in the past 3 days, and 2 of them had lost wheels, and Corwin was out of stock and his waiting list was already 3 weeks long and climbing. Nora said, "I know." She opened the barn doors. The road had not made its worst move yet. The full damage took another 2 weeks to manifest, the way these things do, the accumulated stress finding its worst expression not at the moment of trauma, but in the first ordinary days after, when a load that would have been routine in a sound year met a road that was no longer sound. By the end of April, the count of delayed freight wagons waiting on wheel repair in the valley and in Crails Notch had reached 41 vehicles, with more arriving every day. Corwin's waiting list extended to 6 weeks. The green spokes he had rushed into service were already showing the failure mode Elias had predicted, hairline fractures at the drive joint that announced themselves without warning under load, which meant some of the wheels Corwin had just repaired were already failing again, which lengthened the list further, which was a circular problem that fed on itself and produced, in the men who owned the freight wagons, a specific and escalating desperation. The first man to come to Nora Vass's barn was a freight manager named Peak, who represented 3 of the valley companies and who arrived in a company wagon, clean and well-dressed, with the manner of a man accustomed to setting terms. He came into the barn and saw the wheels on the east wall, and he stood there with his mouth doing something it had not expected to do, which was form no words. There were 209 wheels on the east wall. She had sold 3 to Silas Rook and used 2 from the stock for repairs she had completed the week before. The rest stood in their double rows, tires set, hubs packed, spokes true, each wheel a closed and patient system that had been waiting for this specific week for the better part of 2 years. Peake found his words eventually and offered her Corwin's price and a premium above it. She said she would charge her standard price and no more. He said his companies needed priority. She said everyone who needed a wheel would get one in the order they asked, and her price would not change based on need. He said that was not how business was conducted. She set her hands on the workbench and looked at him and said, "It is how I conduct it." She charged the standard price. She kept the standard price. She did not raise it the following week when Corwin's waiting list reached 10 weeks, and men from as far as the valley floor were driving up to her property at dawn to be first in the queue. She sold from the east wall in the order requests arrived, and when the east wall was half empty, she moved to the remaining stock she had in the loft and on the north wall, and when a man came to her with a broken wheel, she repaired it first if repair was possible and sold him a replacement only if it was not, and the price was the same either way. Silas Rook worked beside her every day that month. They spoke little. The work was its own language. In the second week of May, Aldred Corwin came to the property. He did not come in his good black wagon with the matched bays. He came in a borrowed cart, and he came alone, and he did not come through the gate without knocking. He stood at the gate and waited until Nora came out of the barn, and when she came, he looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man in the process of becoming smaller, a process that is slow and can be watched if you know what to look for. He said he had misjudged the season. He said he had not thought ahead as he ought. He said, and this part cost him, that she had done something he had not credited her with the intelligence to do. He said it badly, because the acknowledgement and the condescension were still entangled in him, but he said it. She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then she asked him if he needed stock. He said yes. She said she had 31 wheels remaining after the day's orders, and she would sell him 20 at her standard price on the condition that he sold them on at no more than her standard price plus his normal markup. He said that was not a margin he could profit from. She said she knew. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said he accepted. He left with 20 wheels in the borrowed cart, and Nora Vass went back into the barn and picked up a spoke blank and a draw knife and began the work of starting over, because the east wall would not fill itself. By the end of that summer, the freight companies had ended their exclusive arrangement with Corwin's shop. It had not been Nora's doing, or not directly. It had been arithmetic. Her wheels held. The road crews in Crail's Notch began buying from her by default, then by preference, then by policy. And when the Valley Freight Association asked her to name her terms for a supply contract, she named them modestly and held to them with the same flat steadiness she held to everything. She never expanded into a large operation. She took on 2 apprentices over the following years, young people she chose for the quality of their attention rather than their strength, and she taught them from the 3 ledgers as primary text, the first for the numbers, the second for the measurements, the third and most important for the failures, because the failures, she told them, are where the knowledge lives. She told them, you cannot understand what holds by studying only what holds. You have to study what broke. One of the apprentices, a young woman from the valley named Delia, asked her once how she had known to start building stock when she did, 2 years before anyone could have predicted the road failure. Nora was at the workbench with the second ledger open, and she did not look up right away, and when she did, she said, "My father counted the pattern. I only counted forward from where he left off." She tapped the open page. The numbers were in Elias Vass's hand, close and careful. The shrinkage tables for ash at various moisture levels, a column of figures that looked like nothing to the uninitiated and looked like a map to anyone who had learned to read it. "The iron tells you everything," she said, "if you hold it long enough to listen." Delia wrote it in her own ledger that evening. She wrote it on the page before the first entry, which was where it belonged. Nora Vass worked until she was 71 years old, which was 3 years longer than her father had managed, and considerably longer than anyone in Crail's Notch had imagined she would manage when they watched her haul broken wagon wheels down the creek road in the first cold autumn of her widowhood, and stacked them in a barn they assumed held nothing but grief. She left the property and the barn and the 3 ledgers to Delia, who left them in turn to a young man she had trained, who eventually donated the ledgers to the County Historical Society, where they were catalogued under the name of Elias Vass as the original author, because the archivist assumed a woman alone would not have been the one to develop the system. The cataloging error was corrected 40 years later by a researcher who noticed that the entries in the 3rd ledger, the red ink book, changed character at a certain page. The handwriting shifted from the father's square compressed letters to a rounder, more deliberate script, and the entries from that page forward showed a sophistication in failure analysis that Elias Vass, gifted as he was, had not yet reached in his lifetime. The researcher added a note to the catalog record. The note said, "Continuation and expansion of the system by Nora Vass, daughter, from year 1 of her ownership of the shop." The original pattern recognition and inventory preparation documented in entries 41 through 63 represent a distinct and original contribution. The barn still stands. The yellow pine her grandfather milled still rings when you strike it. There is a wheel mounted on the east wall, where the rows of stock once leaned. Someone mounted it long ago. Nobody now living remembers who, and drove a small iron plate into the wood beside it. And on the plate, in letters that weather has made soft but not illegible, are the words her father wrote and she lived by and she passed on to everyone she taught. The iron tells you everything if you hold it long enough to listen.